Imagine standing on the windswept shores of Scandinavia 1,000 years ago, where the horizon stretched endlessly and the sea whispered promises of adventure. This was the world of the Vikings, a people whose name alone conjures images of fierce warriors, daring explorers, and visionary leaders. But their story is so much more than the tales of raids and battles that have captured our imaginations. It's a saga of ambition, strategy, and legacy, where a handful of extraordinary individuals didn't just leave their mark. They built dynasties that would endure for generations. Today, we're setting sail into the lives of the 20 most successful Viking leaders, the ones who didn't merely conquer lands but forged empires that shaped the course of history. Think about what it takes to transform a band of warriors into a ruling dynasty. It's not just strength or courage, though they had plenty of both. It's vision, diplomacy, and an uncanny ability to seize opportunity in the chaos of a changing world. These leaders navigated treacherous political landscapes, negotiated alliances, and sometimes even rewrote the rules of power to ensure their bloodlines would thrive long after they were gone. From the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, whose exploits blur the line between myth and history, to Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king whose ambitions nearly reshaped England, their stories are as varied as they are fascinating. But why does this matter to us today? Because the echoes of their decisions still ripple through our world. The borders of nations, the roots of languages, even the genetic makeup of countless people, trace it all back, and you'll find the fingerprints of these Viking dynasties. Their legacy isn't confined to dusty history books. It's alive in the place names we use, the stories we tell, and the cultural traditions that persist centuries later. So if you've ever wondered how a handful of determined leaders could leave such an indelible mark on the world, you're about to find out. This isn't just a journey into the past, it's a chance to uncover the secrets of leadership, resilience, and legacy that still resonate today. Ready to meet the minds behind the myth? Let's begin. Ragnar Lothbrok stands as the towering figure at the crossroads of history and legend, a man whose very name became synonymous with Viking daring. While historians debate whether he was a single warrior king or an amalgamation of many, his impact is undeniable. The sagas paint him as a master strategist. Think of the infamous tale where he supposedly armored himself in tar-soaked clothes to repel a monstrous serpent's venom, turning a seemingly impossible battle into a triumph. It's these larger-than-life stories that cemented his reputation, but his true power lay in the dynasty he spawned. His sons weren't just heirs, they were forces of nature in their own right. Ivar the Boneless, despite his physical limitations, became a fearsome tactician who carved out kingdoms in England. Bjorn Ironside sailed farther than most Vikings dared, raiding as far as the Mediterranean and leaving a trail of settlements in his wake. Even Ragnar's death, if the sagas are to be believed, became a catalyst for vengeance. His execution in a pit of snakes allegedly sparked the great heathen army's invasion of England. What makes Ragnar extraordinary isn't just his own deeds, but how he became a symbol. Later rulers would claim descent from him to legitimize their power, weaving his legend into the fabric of their rule. And that's the paradox of Ragnar Lothbrok. The less we know for certain, the more his influence grows. His legacy isn't just in the lands he conquered, but in the idea he embodied that a single leader's ambition could ignite generations of expansion. Now let's turn to a ruler who left far fewer mysteries in his wake, Harald Fairhair, the man who unified Norway with a mix of steel and shrewd diplomacy. Where Ragnar's story is wrapped in myth, Harald's is written in the clear ink of history. If Ragnar Lothbrok was the legend that set the Viking world ablaze, His son Ivar the Boneless was the cold, calculating mind that turned that fire into an empire. His very nickname, whether referring to a physical disability or a serpent-like ability to bend without breaking, hints at the enigma he embodied. While other Viking leaders relied on brute strength, Ivar's genius lay in his mind. When the great heathen army landed on England's shores in the year 865, it wasn't just a raid, it was a campaign of conquest, and Ivar was its architect. He didn't just defeat kingdoms, he dismantled them piece by piece. Take the fall of East Anglia, where he captured King Edmund, not with a straightforward battle, but by exploiting divisions among the local rulers. Some sources claim Edmund was executed in a ritualistic manner, a chilling message to anyone who dared resist. But Ivar wasn't just a warlord. He ruled Dublin with the same shrewdness he showed on the battlefield, turning it into a thriving hub of trade and power. His influence stretched back to Scandinavia, where he secured alliances that kept his family dominant for generations. That's the real mark of his legacy. He didn't just win battles, he built systems. Even his mysterious disappearance from history feels deliberate, as if he stepped off the stage once his work was done, leaving behind a dynasty that would shape the British Isles for centuries. Now consider Bjorn Ironside, the explorer who carried his father's ambition beyond the horizon. Where Ivar mastered the politics of conquest, Bjorn embodied the Viking spirit of discovery, sailing farther than most thought possible. His journeys weren't just about plunder, they were about rewriting the map itself. Bjorn Ironside didn't just follow in his father's footsteps, he sailed far beyond them. While other Vikings were content raiding the coasts of England and France, Bjorn set his sights on the Mediterranean, a realm of untold wealth and unimaginable danger. Picture this, a fleet of Viking longships built for the icy waters of the north, venturing into the sun-drenched seas of southern Europe. It was like taking a knife to a gunfight, except Bjorn's audacity turned that knife into a weapon no one saw coming. His raids along the coasts of Spain, Italy, and even North Africa weren't just about plunder, they were a statement. The Vikings weren't just seasonal threats, they could strike anywhere, anytime. One of his most legendary exploits was the sacking of Luna, an Italian town Bjorn supposedly mistook for Rome. The story goes that he faked his own death to gain entry, then sprang from his coffin to lead a devastating attack. Whether true or embellished, the tale captures his cunning, but Bjorn's real legacy wasn't just in the treasures he stole, it was in the lands he claimed. Back in Sweden, he founded the Munster dynasty, turning a lifetime of raiding into a permanent seat of power. This was the Viking playbook at its finest. Raid to build reputation, then use that reputation to build a kingdom. What set Bjorn apart wasn't just his bravery, but his adaptability. The Mediterranean wasn't just unfamiliar waters, it was a chessboard of rival empires from the Byzantines to the Moors. Yet Bjorn navigated these complexities with a mix of intimidation and diplomacy, knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. His success laid the groundwork for future Viking ventures, proving that their reach could extend far beyond the foggy shores of the north. And that's the irony of Bjorn's story. The man who terrified southern Europe ended up as a king, his name etched not just in sagas but in the very lineage of Swedish rulers. Now consider the contrast with our next leader, Harald Bluetooth, who traded the raider's axe for the crown's scepter, using faith and alliances to forge a different kind of legacy. Where Bjorn expanded horizons, Harald consolidated them, turning scattered territories into a unified kingdom. Harald Fairhair's story begins with a vow so bold it could have been ripped straight from the sagas. A teenage warrior swearing not to cut his hair until he ruled all of Norway. It wasn't just youthful bravado, it was the spark that ignited a kingdom, Imagine the sheer audacity of that promise in a land fractured into petty fiefdoms, where local chieftains clung fiercely to their power. Yet Harald didn't just dream of unity, he engineered it with a mix of battlefield brilliance and political cunning. His victory at the Battle of Hafrsfjord wasn't just another clash of axes, it was the moment Norway's scattered tribes realized resistance was futile. With his rivals crushed or bending the knee, Harald finally sheared his infamous locks, earning the name Fairhair and a crown to match. But here's what sets Harald apart from other Viking warlords. He didn't stop at conquest. He built systems, taxes, laws, even a rudimentary bureaucracy. These were the tools he used to transform a patchwork of raiding parties into a functioning kingdom. His reign marked a turning point where Viking leaders shifted from being mere strongmen to true monarchs, ruling by more than just fear. Yet power this centralized came at a cost. His son Eric Bloodaxe earned his grim nickname through fratricidal strife, proving that even the most stable dynasties could fracture under ambition. What's fascinating is how Harald's legacy endured beyond the bloodshed. By tying his lineage to the very idea of Norway, he gave his descendants an unshakable claim to the throne, one that echoed through centuries. Later rulers, from Olaf Trigvassen to Harald Hardrada, traced their authority back to Fairhair's unifying vision. His story isn't just about swords and sovereignty, it's a masterclass in how charisma and ruthlessness can forge a nation from chaos. Now consider the contrast with our next leader, Swain Forkbeard, who took Harald's playbook and applied it on an even grander scale. Where Fairhair consolidated one kingdom, Forkbeard set his sights on an empire, weaving together Denmark, Norway, and England through a web of raids and royal marriages. The age of mere warlords was ending, the age of Viking kings had truly begun. Rollo's story reads like a Viking saga rewritten by history itself. A man who began his life as a raider, feared along the coasts of Francia, and ended it as a duke, his bloodline destined to reshape kingdoms. Picture the scene in the year 911 when the Frankish king Charles the Simple, weary of relentless Viking raids, made an offer few could have predicted: land in exchange for loyalty. But this wasn't mere appeasement. Rollo, the towering Norse chieftain, saw beyond the short-term gains of plunder. He recognized an opportunity to trade his ships for something far more enduring: a title, a territory, and a legacy. The Treaty of St. Clair sur Epte didn't just mark the birth of Normandy, it was a masterstroke of reinvention. What's remarkable isn't just Rollo's rise to nobility, but how he straddled two worlds without losing his edge. He swore fealty to the Frankish crown, yes, but on his own terms. Legend says he refused to kneel and kiss the king's foot, instead ordering a warrior to do it for him, nearly toppling Charles in the process. This was no puppet ruler. Rollo kept his Viking instinct sharp, defending his new lands with the same ferocity he'd once used to raid them. Yet he also embraced the trappings of power, adopting Christianity, enforcing laws, and even redistributing land to his followers in a way that mirrored Frankish feudalism. The result, a cultural alloy that made Normandy uniquely formidable: Norse resilience fused with Frankish sophistication. And then there's the ripple effect. Rollo's descendants, like William the Conqueror, didn't just inherit land, they inherited his ambition. When William crossed the English Channel in 1066, he wasn't just a Norman duke, he was the embodiment of his ancestors' vision, a Viking's grandson wielding a crown. Rollo's true genius lay in understanding that power isn't just taken, it's legitimized. He traded his axe for a scepter, but the warrior's heart never left his lineage. Now shift your gaze to a leader who wielded terror as a weapon: Eric the Red, the fiery exile who turned a frozen wasteland into a Viking stronghold. Where Rollo negotiated with kings, Erik defied them, carving his own destiny in a land even the bravest hesitated to tread. Erik Bloodaxe wasn't just a king, he was a storm in human form, a living contradiction who wielded both the battle axe and the poet's quill with equal ferocity. Son of Harald Fairhair, the unifier of Norway, Erik inherited more than just a crown. He carried the weight of a dynasty's expectations. His nickname wasn't given lightly. Legend says he earned it by dispatching his own brothers to secure his throne, a brutal but effective strategy in an age where power often flowed through bloodlines literally spilled on the ground. Yet for all his violence, Erik's reign over Northumbria in the early 10th century wasn't just about terror. York, the jewel of his kingdom, became a rare Viking capital where Norse and Anglo-Saxon cultures collided and coexisted. The streets echoed with Old Norse poetry as much as the clang of swords, thanks to Erik's patronage of skalds who preserved the sagas of his people. What's fascinating about Erik isn't just his brutality, but the way he embodied the Viking paradox, destroyer and preserver in one. His rule was fleeting, yes, but explosive. He didn't just occupy Northumbria, he reshaped it, minting coins with his name and symbols that blended Christian crosses with Thor's hammers. Some chroniclers paint him as a tyrant, a man who burned monasteries without a second thought. Others suggest he was a pragmatist, ruling a fractured land the only way he knew how, by being the sharpest blade in the room. His downfall came not from weakness but from the very ambition that fueled him. Betrayed and outmaneuvered, Erik's death at Stainmore Pass marked more than the end of a king. It was the closing chapter of Viking York's golden age. Yet even in defeat, his legacy endured. His widow, Gunhild, became a power broker in her own right, weaving alliances that kept their family's influence alive. The debate over Erik's true nature, butcher or bold leader, mirrors the larger question about Vikings themselves. Were they mindless raiders or complex figures navigating a world where mercy was often a luxury? Maybe the answer lies somewhere in between. Now consider the stark contrast of our next figure, Olaf Trigvassen, who traded the old gods for a new faith without ever losing his Viking fire. Where Erik's story ends in blood and uncertainty, Olaf's begins with a baptism and a sword pointed at the unconverted. Olaf Trigvassen's life reads like a Viking saga penned by fate itself, a boy sold into slavery who rose to wear a crown, only to trade Thor's hammer for the cross without ever shedding his warrior's edge. Imagine a child barely 3 years old fleeing his homeland after his father's murder, only to be captured and sold in Estonia. Most would have vanished into obscurity. But Olaf, he fought his way out, blade in hand, and by his 20s he was raiding coasts from England to the Baltic, his name whispered with equal parts fear and awe. Then came the twist that would define his legacy, a chance meeting with a Christian hermit in the Scilly Isles. The old man's prophecy that Olaf would become a king wasn't just a prediction, it was a spark. When it came true, Olaf didn't just convert to Christianity, he weaponized it. This wasn't the gentle spread of faith by monks and missionaries. Olaf's conversion was a political masterstroke. Returning to Norway in 995, he didn't ask his people to embrace the new god, he demanded it, often at sword point. Churches replaced pagan temples, and baptism became the price of loyalty. Yet for all his zeal, Olaf understood the power of spectacle. He staged grand debates between Christian priests and pagan chieftains, rigging the outcomes with miracles straight out of the Bible, or at least that's how the sagas tell it. The message was clear, his rule and his God were inseparable. But here's what sets Olaf apart. His faith didn't dull his Viking instincts. He used Christianity to unify Norway under his banner, yes, but he also kept raiding, kept conquering. His alliance with Swain Forkbeard of Denmark wasn't built on piety, it was built on shared ambition. even his death, lost at sea in the year 1000 during a climactic naval battle, became a legend. Some said he leapt from his ship in full armor, vanishing beneath the waves rather than surrender. It was the perfect end for a man who straddled two worlds, a king who died like a Viking, leaving behind a Norway forever changed. Olaf's legacy isn't just in the souls he converted, but in the blueprint he created. He proved that faith could be a tool of conquest as sharp as any axe, a way to bind disparate tribes into a kingdom. His successors, from Olaf the Saint to Harald Hardrada, would follow his playbook, blending cross and crown. And that's the irony. The man who helped bury the old gods became a near-mythic figure himself, a symbol of transformation in an age of upheaval. Now turn your gaze to Sainthood the Great, a ruler who took Olaf's lessons and applied them to an empire. Where Trigvassen unified Norway through faith and force, Sainthood would weave together three kingdoms under a single crown, proving that Viking ambition knew no borders. Sainthood the Great didn't just wear a crown, he wore three of them, stitching together an empire across the North Sea that would make even the most ambitious Viking chieftains pause. Here was a ruler who could crush rebellions in England with one hand and pen pious letters to the church with the other, a man equally at home in the mead halls of Denmark and the cathedrals of Winchester. His reign marked a turning point where Viking power stopped being about raids and started being about rule. Take his famous gesture on the shores of England, where he commanded the tide to halt, not because he believed he could, but to prove to his courtiers that even kings had limits. It was a masterclass in political theater, a way to temper his image from conqueror to statesman. But Sainthood's real genius lay in his ability to balance opposites. He kept the Danegeld, the tribute system that had funded Viking raids for generations, but redirected that wealth into building churches and monasteries. He maintained the loyalty of his Norse warriors while winning over Anglo-Saxon nobles by upholding their laws, even marrying Emma of Normandy, the widow of his predecessor, to solidify his claim. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was cultural alchemy. Under Sainthood, London became a hub where Viking traders and English merchants thrived side by side, where coins bore both the cross and the raven. His court attracted scholars and skalds alike, blending Old English poetry with Norse sagas. Yet for all his sophistication, Sainthood never let anyone forget his Viking roots. When he sailed to Rome in 1027, it wasn't just a pilgrimage, it was a flex. By negotiating lower tolls for Scandinavian pilgrims and securing recognition from the Pope, he elevated his empire's status on Europe's stage. His death in 1035 marked the end of a fleeting but transformative era. The North Sea Empire fractured soon after, but its blueprint endured. Future rulers, from William the Conqueror to the Holy Roman Emperors, would study Sainthood's playbook, how to wield faith as a tool, how to rule diverse peoples without crushing their identities, how to be both a warrior and a builder. Now shift your gaze from the king who tamed waves to the queen who defied them, Sigrid the Haughty, a woman who refused to bow to kings or custom, shaping Scandinavia's fate with nothing but her will and a well-timed feast. Where Sainthood mastered balance, Sigrid wielded fire. Lagertha stands as a paradox, a figure so vivid in the sagas that scholars still debate whether she was flesh and blood or legend-given form. The tales describe her with the ferocity of a storm, a shield maiden who fought alongside Ragnar Lothbrok, her golden hair whipping behind her as she wielded axe and shield with equal skill. But what makes her truly remarkable isn't just her battlefield prowess, it's how she defied the expectations of her era. Viking society, often portrayed as a masculine world of raiders and kings, had room for women like Lagertha to seize power. When Ragnar sought her hand, the stories say she set a challenge. He'd have to defeat a bear and a hound guarding her hall. His success won him her loyalty, but never her subservience. Later, when their marriage fractured, she didn't fade into obscurity, she ruled. The sagas claim Lagertha became a sovereign in her own right, governing lands with the same decisiveness she'd shown in battle. This wasn't just poetic license. Archaeological finds like the Birka warrior grave, where a high-status burial filled with weapons turned out to belong to a woman, prove that shieldmaidens weren't mere myth. Viking women could inherit property, initiate divorces, and in rare cases, lead. Lagertha's legacy, whether historical or symbolic, reveals a culture that respected strength in all its forms. Her story resonated so deeply that centuries later, Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus wove her into his chronicles, ensuring her name would outlive the longships she once sailed. What's compelling about Lagertha isn't just her individual deeds, but what she represents: the blurred line between Viking reality and ideal. She embodies the Norse reverence for fierce independence, a quality that transcended gender. The very fact that her tale was preserved, embellished, and celebrated speaks volumes. In a world where reputation was currency, Lagertha's legend became a kind of inheritance, proof that valor wasn't confined to one sex. Now shift your gaze from the Shieldmaidens' Hall to the open sea, where Eric the Red turned exile into opportunity. While Lagertha mastered the politics of land, Eric embraced the unknown, founding a settlement where others saw only frozen wilderness. His story isn't just about survival, it's about rewriting the rules of possibility. Leif Erikson didn't just sail into the unknown, he rewrote history. Picture this: a wooden longship cutting through the frigid Atlantic waves, its crew squinting at a coastline no European had ever seen. This wasn't just another raid or trade mission, it was a leap into legend. While his father, Eric the Red, had turned exile into opportunity by colonizing Greenland, Leif went further. Around the year 1000, he landed on the shores of North America, a place he called Vinland for the wild grapes that grew there. The sagas described lush meadows and timber so abundant it seemed a gift from the gods, a stark contrast to Greenland's icy cliffs. For a fleeting moment, Vikings walked where Columbus wouldn't set foot for another 500 years. But why Vinland, and why didn't it last? Leif's settlement at Elant's Oaks Meadows, discovered by archaeologists in the 1960s, reveals a tantalizing glimpse of what might have been. The site had everything Vikings needed: iron-rich bogs for forging tools, timber for shipbuilding, even butternuts suggesting trade with indigenous peoples. Yet the colony lasted barely a decade. Some blame clashes with the Skrælings, the Norse term for the native inhabitants, while others point to the sheer logistical nightmare of sustaining a foothold so far from home. But perhaps the real answer lies in Viking priorities. Unlike Greenland, which offered prestige and walrus ivory for European markets, Vinland had no obvious trade commodity to justify the perilous journey. For a culture that valued reputation as much as riches, Leif's discovery became more legend than livelihood. What makes Leif's story extraordinary isn't just the journey itself, but how it reflects the Viking spirit at its boldest. He didn't have maps or compasses, just the stars, the currents, and the sheer nerve to trust them. His voyage proved the Norse could cross an ocean, but it also revealed the limits of their expansion. Without the support networks of Greenland or Iceland, even paradise wasn't worth the price. Yet in failing to colonize Vinland, Leif succeeded in something greater. He turned the Atlantic into a Viking highway, linking continents centuries before the so-called Age of Discovery. Now consider the contrast with Olaf Haraldsson, a king who looked inward rather than outward. Where Leif sought new worlds, Olaf fought to preserve the old one, waging a holy war to keep Norway Norse in the face of changing tides. His story isn't about exploration, it's about identity and what happens when a culture's soul is at stake. Harald Hardrada wasn't just a king, he was the Viking Age's final thunderclap, a man whose life read like an epic stitched together by fate's most dramatic hands. Exiled as a teenager after his half-brother, King Olaf, fell at the Battle of Stiklestad, Harald didn't just survive, he transformed exile into an education. By 15, he was fighting as a mercenary in the Byzantine Empire's Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Norse warriors who served as the emperor's personal shock troops. Imagine a teenager from the fjords navigating the labyrinthine politics of Constantinople, trading axe blows on battlefields from Sicily to the Levant, amassing wealth and skills that would fuel his ambitions for decades. This wasn't just survival, it was a masterclass in reinvention. By the time he returned to Scandinavia, Harald had honed a style of kingship that blended Viking ruthlessness with Byzantine sophistication. His rule over Norway was iron-fisted yet shrewd. He centralized power, minted coins bearing his likeness, and even founded Oslo as a strategic stronghold. But what truly set him apart was his refusal to accept limits. When Denmark resisted his claims, he launched a grueling 17-year campaign to conquer it, a war of attrition that showcased his tenacity. Though he never fully subdued the Danes, the message was clear. Harald would bend the world to his will or die trying. Then came the crown jewel of his ambitions, England. The year 1066 is famous for William the Conqueror's invasion, but Harold's bid for the English throne was just as audacious. Landing in the north with a fleet of 300 ships, he crushed local forces at the Battle of Fulford, only to meet his end days later at Stamford Bridge. The sagas describe his final moments with poetic gravity, a towering figure in armor, swinging his axe until an arrow found his throat. His death wasn't just the fall of a king, it was the closing of an era. With him died the last great Viking dream of a North Sea empire. Yet Harald's legacy isn't just in his failures, but in the sheer scale of his ambition. He bridged worlds from the icy halls of Norway to the marble palaces of Byzantium, proving that Viking prowess could thrive far beyond the longship. Had he succeeded at Stamford Bridge, the map of Europe might have been redrawn under Norse rule. Instead, he became a symbol, the last king who dared to live and die, as the Vikings of legend did, with a sword in hand and glory in sight. Now, shift your gaze eastward to a leader who blended Viking ferocity with Slavic diplomacy, Sviatoslav the Brave, the Kievan Rus prince who carved an empire from the steppes with a Viking's heart and a strategist's mind. Where Harald sought crowns, Sviatoslav conquered for the sheer thrill of the fight, his campaigns rewriting the rules of power in the Slavic world. Rurik's arrival in the lands of the Slavs wasn't a raid, it was an invitation. Picture the scene in the mid-9th century. Slavic and Finnic tribes, weary of internal strife, sought an outsider to impose order. Their solution, a Viking chieftain named Rurik, whose name would echo through history as the founder of the Rus. This wasn't conquest by force, but a negotiated takeover, a deal struck between wary allies. The chronicles say Rurik settled in Novgorod, a trading hub where the Volkhov River met the Baltic world, and from there he began weaving Norse ambition into Slavic soil. What's fascinating isn't just his rise to power, but how quickly his lineage became indistinguishable from the people they ruled. Within generations, the Rurikids spoke Slavic, married local nobles, and adopted Orthodox Christianity, yet they never let go of their Viking knack for expansion. Take Oleg the Prophet, Rurik's successor, who didn't just inherit a kingdom, he redefined it. With a mix of cunning and showmanship, Oleg captured Kiev, a strategic gem on the Dnieper River, allegedly by smuggling his warriors past the gates hidden beneath trading boats. Once inside, he declared the city the mother of all Rus cities, a phrase that still resonates today. Under Oleg, the Rus became more than just a federation of tribes. They became a conduit for trade, linking the Baltic to Byzantium. His famous raid on Constantinople in 907 wasn't just about plunder, it was a statement. When he nailed his shield to the city's gates, it symbolized something new, a Viking dynasty that could bend empires to its will. But Rurik's true legacy lies in the paradox of his rule. Here was a Norse warlord whose descendants became the architects of Slavic identity. The very name Rus, likely derived from the Old Norse word for rowers or seafarers, evolved into the root of Russia and Belarus. His dynasty lasted 7 centuries, outliving Viking Age itself, shaping everything from legal codes to religious art. And that's the untold story of Rurik, not just as a conqueror, but as a cultural alchemist. He proved that the most enduring Viking legacy wasn't always written in blood, but in the slow, deliberate merging of peoples and traditions. Now, consider the contrast with our next leader, Swain Forkbeard, who didn't blend into foreign lands but conquered them outright, turning Denmark into the heart of a North Sea empire. Where Rurik's descendants became Slavic, Swain's heirs would become legends of a different kind, kings who didn't just rule but reshaped the map of Europe. Olaf the Stout, later known as Saint Olaf, was a man of contradictions, a Viking king who wielded both the sword and the cross with equal fervor. When he seized Norway's throne in 1015, he didn't just inherit a kingdom, he took on a mission. Christianity had already begun creeping into Scandinavia, but Olaf didn't wait for gradual conversion. He saw faith as a tool of unity, a way to bind Norway's fractious chieftains under a single god and a single king. His methods were anything but gentle. Pagan temples burned, resistors faced exile or execution, and local rulers who refused baptism soon found Olaf's armies at their gates. To some, this was tyranny. To others, it was the price of progress. What's fascinating isn't just Olaf's zeal, but the legacy it created. His death at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 wasn't the end of his influence, it was the beginning of his myth. Defeated by rebellious nobles and Danish forces, Olaf fell not as a failed king, but as a martyr. Within a year, miracles were attributed to his gravesite, and the very chieftains who'd opposed him now embraced his sainthood. The church canonized him, and his son Magnus, raised in exile, returned to reclaim the throne with the aura of his father's holiness. Suddenly, Olaf's brutal methods were sanctified by history, his violence rewritten as divine purpose. But was this truly a spiritual awakening or political genius? Olaf's reign laid the groundwork for Norway's Christian identity, yes, but it also centralized royal power like never before. By tying his lineage to the church, he ensured his descendants ruled with both earthly and heavenly authority. Future kings, from Harald Hardrada to Håkon the Good, would trace their legitimacy back to Olaf's bloodline and his sanctity. Even his nickname, the Stout, hints at the duality of his legacy, a man physically imposing yet spiritually revered, a Viking who became a saint. Now consider the contrast with our next leader, Swain Estridsson, a king who traded Olaf's fiery sermons for shrewd alliances. Where Olaf forced conversion, Swain navigated the tides of faith and power with a diplomat's finesse, proving that in the Viking world, persuasion could be as potent as the sword. Gorm the Old might not have left behind sagas filled with dragon ships or epic battles, but his quiet pragmatism shaped Denmark more profoundly than any raider's axe. Picture a land fractured into rival chiefdoms, where loyalty rarely extended beyond the next fjord. Gorm didn't conquer with spectacle, he unified through patience. His reign in the early 10th century was less about blazing trails and more about building fences, stitching together a kingdom through marriages, oaths, and the occasional show of force. The Jelling Stone, erected in memory of his wife Thyra, tells part of the story. Gorm made this monument to Thyra, his wife, Denmark's salvation. That word, Denmark, isn't just a name. It's a declaration. For the first time, scattered territories were being spoken of as one. What's remarkable isn't just Gorm's political maneuvering, but how he balanced tradition with innovation. He kept the old gods close, yet didn't resist the Christian influences creeping north from Germany. His court at Jelling became a crossroads of ideas, where Norse paganism and European Christianity coexisted, a flexibility his son Harald would later exploit. Gorm's real genius lay in his restraint. While other Viking rulers chased glory abroad, he focused on consolidating power at home, strengthening trade routes, and neutralizing rivals not with bloodshed but with alliances. The archaeological record tells the tale. Fortresses like Fyrkat and Trelleborg, often credited to Harald, likely began under Gorm's watch. These weren't just military strongholds, they were the bones of a nation, hubs of administration and control. Yet Gorm's legacy is also one of paradox. The man who unified Denmark spent his final years in grief, reportedly heartbroken after Thyra's death. His son Harald would later rebury him beneath Jelling's church, a Christian rebuke to his pagan roots. But even in this act, Gorm's influence endured. By giving Harald a stable kingdom to inherit, he'd set the stage for Denmark's transformation from a patchwork of warlords to a European power. His name, the Old, wasn't just a nod to his age. It was a testament to endurance, the foundation upon which empires are built. Now, turn to a leader who embodied raw strength, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, the warrior whose very nickname spoke of his battlefield ferocity. Where Gorm ruled with quiet calculation, Sigurd fought with a flair that blurred myth and history, his deeds etched into legend as deeply as the runes on a memorial stone. Swain Forkbeard didn't just wear a crown, he forged an empire that stretched across the North Sea, proving Viking ambition could reshape kingdoms as easily as it had once plundered them. His rise began in the shadow of his father, Harald Bluetooth, but Swain wasn't content with mere inheritance. Denmark was just the starting point. By the late 10th century, he'd turned his gaze to England, a land already scarred by decades of Viking raids. Yet Swain wasn't after quick spoils, he wanted the throne itself. His campaigns against Ethelred the Unready weren't just raids, they were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Year after year, he returned, extracting ever larger Danegeld payments until England's treasury bled dry. Then, in 1013, he struck the final blow. With London under siege and Ethelred fleeing to Normandy, Swain was proclaimed king. For a fleeting moment, a Viking sat on England's throne, not as a puppet, but as its undisputed ruler. But Swain's ambitions didn't stop at the English Channel. Norway, weakened by internal strife, fell next. Olaf Trigvassen, the Christian king who'd once unified the country, drowned in battle against Swain's allies, leaving Norway ripe for takeover. What's striking isn't just the scale of Swain's conquests, but their speed. Within a decade, he'd woven Denmark, England, and Norway into a loose but formidable empire, a precursor to his son Signat's later achievements. Yet Swain's reign lasted barely a year before his sudden death in 1014. Some chroniclers claim he was struck down by divine wrath for his persecution of Christians. Others suggest more earthly intrigues. Either way, his legacy wasn't in the years he ruled, but in the blueprint he left. What fueled such relentless expansion? Partly, it was pragmatism. Control of England meant control of its silver, a lifeline for funding armies and rewarding loyalty. But there's a deeper thread here. The Viking world was changing. Swain didn't just raid, he ruled, adapting to the trappings of kingship without shedding his Norse instincts. He minted coins bearing his name, patronized the church despite his pagan reputation, and leveraged alliances with Normandy and Scandinavia's rising powers. His story isn't just one of conquest, but of transformation, a bridge between the raiding age and the era of Viking kings who would leave dynasties, not just ruins, in their wake. Now, shift your gaze to the man who mastered those very waves Swain's fleets once sailed. Thorkel the Tall, a warrior whose loyalty was as fluid as the tides, switching sides between Vikings and English kings with a strategist's precision. Where Swain sought crowns, Thorkel wielded influence like a dagger, proving that in the Viking world, power didn't always wear a crown. Sigurd's snake in the eyes name alone conjures images of a man born from legend, part warrior, part enigma, his very nickname whispered in sagas as if it held secrets. The son of Ragnar Lothbrok, he carried the weight of a father whose deeds blurred the line between history and myth. But Sigurd wasn't just living in Ragnar's shadow. He was carving his own path through the tangled politics of Viking Age Denmark. Some scholars argue he might even be the missing link between the legendary Lothbrok clan and the real-life Jelling dynasty, the family that would later unify Denmark under Gorm the Old. Imagine that, a man whose existence is half folklore, half historical puzzle, yet whose bloodline may have shaped a kingdom. The sagas offer glimpses of Sigurd's cunning. Unlike his brothers who sought vengeance or conquest, Sigurd played the long game. He married Bleja, daughter of the Anglo-Saxon king Eilert, the same ruler who allegedly executed Ragnar in that infamous snake pit. Was this a political masterstroke, binding his family's enemies to him through marriage, or a quiet act of reconciliation in an age of endless feuds? The truth is as elusive as the serpentine mark that supposedly gave Sigurd his name. Some tales claim he was born with a strange symbol coiled in his eye, a sign of Odin's favor. Others suggest it was a metaphor for his piercing gaze, a leader who saw moves ahead of his rivals. What's undeniable is Sigurd's legacy in the land he ruled. The Jelling stones, those massive rune-carved monuments often credited to Harald Bluetooth, might trace their origins back to Sigurd's era. Could the serpent motifs coiled around those stones be a nod to his lineage? It's a tantalizing theory, one that ties the mythic past to the rise of a Christian Denmark. Sigurd's story isn't just about battles or territory, it's about how legends become foundations. His descendants, whether through blood or borrowed prestige, wielded power that echoed Ragnar's name while building something new. Now, shift focus to a ruler whose path couldn't have been more different, Olaf the Saint, a king who traded the serpent's cunning for the cross's clarity. Where Sigurd navigated the shadows of paganism and politics, Olaf wielded faith like a weapon, forging a Norway that would never look back. Harald Bluetooth's name might sound like a modern tech gimmick, but his impact on history was anything but fleeting. Picture Denmark in the 10th century, a land where pagan gods still held sway, but the tides of change were rolling in from Christian Europe. Harald didn't just adapt to those tides, he harnessed them. The Jelling stones, those massive rune-carved monuments, tell his story in stone. One side bears pagan imagery, the other a crucified Christ. It's a visual metaphor for his reign, a bridge between worlds. But this wasn't just spiritual theater. Harald's conversion was political genius. By embracing Christianity, he gained legitimacy in the eyes of European rulers, securing alliances and trade networks that strengthened his grip on power. Yet Harald never fully abandoned his Viking roots. He rebuilt Denmark's military with circular fortresses like Trelleborg, geometric marvels that doubled as power centers and trading hubs. These weren't just forts, they were statements. Each one echoed the precision of a king who understood that control required both sword and ledger. His reign also saw the first unified Danish currency, coins stamped with his name and cross, weaving faith and commerce into the fabric of daily life. And then there's the irony of his nickname. Bluetooth might stem from a discolored tooth, but it's his legacy of connection that endured. Centuries later, engineers named wireless technology after him, symbolizing his role as a unifier. Whether forging alliances or erecting runestones, Harald proved that true power lies not in choosing between old and new, but in blending them. Now, shift your gaze to a figure who defies history's grasp, Ragnhild the Mighty, a shield maiden whose deeds blur the line between saga and reality. Where Harald left monuments, she left mysteries, her story whispered in the echoes of forgotten battles. Egil Skallagrimsson wasn't just a warrior, he was a walking contradiction, a man who could split skulls with his axe one moment and compose verses so poignant they'd move listeners to tears the next. Picture this, a hulking berserker with a face so ugly the sagas claimed he could frighten enemies just by scowling, yet whose poetry revealed a mind as sharp as his blade. His life, immortalized in Egil's saga, reads like a Viking epic penned by a philosopher. When his beloved son drowned, he didn't just mourn, he carved his grief into runes, writing the Sonatoric, a lament so raw it still resonates today. "The sea has robbed me of my son," he wrote, blending fury and sorrow in lines that defy the stereotype of mindless Norse brutality. But Egil's brilliance wasn't confined to parchment. His battles were as legendary as his verses. At just 12 years old, he killed another boy in a dispute over a game, an early hint of the temper that would define him. Later, he slaughtered entire bands of enemies, once decapitating a rival and tossing the head at his foes mid-battle. Yet even in bloodshed, there was artistry. His most famous exploit, a curse poem so potent it allegedly drove Norway's King Erik Bloodaxe to exile him. Imagine wielding words as weapons, turning poetry into a tool of survival. What makes Egil extraordinary isn't just his dual mastery of violence and verse, but what his life reveals about Viking society. Here was a culture that valued scalds as much as swordsmen, where a well-crafted insult could be as deadly as an arrow. His saga doesn't just recount deeds, it dissects human nature, exploring themes of loyalty, loss, and the price of pride. Even his final act was poetic justice. Old and blind, he allegedly buried his silver rather than let his greedy heirs inherit it, a last defiant stroke from a man who refused to be predictable. Now consider the stark contrast of our next figure, Olaf the Peacock, a leader whose life was shaped not by rage or runes, but by prophecy. Where Egil carved his path through sheer will, Olaf's destiny seemed written in the stars, a reminder that Viking leaders navigated fate as fiercely as they did the seas. Halfdan Ragnarsson didn't just ride the wave of the great heathen army, he helped create it. While his brother Ivar the Boneless masterminded the invasion of England, Halfdan brought the raw force needed to turn strategy into conquest. Picture the chaos of Northumbria in the late 9th century, its kingdoms fracturing under Viking pressure. Halfdan didn't just exploit that weakness, he institutionalized it. After the infamous execution of King Edmund, he didn't abandon East Anglia to chaos, he installed puppet rulers, ensuring a steady flow of tribute. But his real prize was London. Unlike the hit-and-run raids of earlier Vikings, Halfdan's occupation was a statement. The Norse weren't just passing through, they were putting down roots. What set Halfdan apart was his ability to balance terror with governance. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes him splitting captured lands among his warriors, transforming raiders into landlords overnight. This wasn't just looting, it was nation-building with a Viking twist. York became a thriving Norse hub under his watch, its streets echoing with Old Norse and Old English alike. Yet for all his success in England, Halfdan's fate took a mysterious turn. Drawn by Ireland's wealth or perhaps familial rivalry, he sailed west only to meet his end in a skirmish near Dublin. The annals are vague. Some say he drowned fleeing battle, others claim he was betrayed. What's certain is that his death left a power vacuum in England, one that Alfred the Great would soon exploit. Halfdan's legacy lies in the contradictions he embodied. A destroyer who built settlements, a warlord who understood the value of stability, he represented the Viking Age at its most transformative. His story reminds us that even the fiercest conquerors could become architects of the very societies they once raised. Now we reach our final leader, Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king whose death at Stamford Bridge didn't just end his life but an entire era. Where Halfdan helped forge England's Viking Age, Harald would be the one to bring the curtain down on it, his ambitions as vast as the world he sought to claim. Magnus the Good stood apart from the Viking rulers who came before him like a quiet harbor after a storm. While men like Harald Hardrada and Olaf the Stout forged their legacies in blood and iron, Magnus inherited a Norway fractured by civil war and weary of conflict. His very nickname, the Good, speaks volumes, a title earned not through conquest, but through an almost unprecedented commitment to reconciliation. Picture this, a young man, barely 11 when his father Olaf fell at Stiklestad, suddenly recalled from exile in Kievan Rus to rule over the same chieftains who had opposed his father's harsh Christian reforms. Where others might have sought vengeance, Magnus chose peace. His first act as king in 1035 was a masterstroke of political healing. Instead of purging his enemies, he granted amnesty to the nobles who had fought against Olaf, even restoring their land. This wasn't weakness, it was strategy. By weaving loyalty rather than demanding it, Magnus stabilized Norway faster than any battlefield victory could have. He understood something his predecessors often missed. Lasting power required more than fear. It needed consent. His legal reforms, like standardizing weights and measures across trading towns, weren't glamorous, but they bound the kingdom together in ways swords never could. Yet Magnus was no pacifist. When Denmark's throne fell vacant, he claimed it by right of his maternal lineage, briefly uniting the two crowns. But even here, his approach differed. Rather than ruling through force, he negotiated with Danish nobles, earning their allegiance through compromise. The sagas recount how he famously refused to wear his helmet during a tense standoff with rebels, exposing his face to show he came to talk, not fight. That single gesture, a king vulnerable yet confident, disarmed tensions where armies might have failed. What makes Magnus's story so poignant is its brevity. He died suddenly at 23, his potential unfulfilled. Yet in just 7 years, he reshaped Viking kingship's very definition. His reign proved that stability could be as powerful as expansion, that mercy could forge stronger bonds than terror. In our journey through 20 Viking leaders, Magnus offers a quiet but profound finale, a reminder that even in an age of axes and longships, the most enduring legacies were sometimes built with wisdom, not steel. From the shadowy legends of Ragnar Lothbrok to the thunderous fall of Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, the stories of these 20 Viking leaders rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Norse world. They weren't just raiders in horned helmets, though pop culture loves that image, but architects of empires, weaving kingdoms from chaos with equal parts steel and vision. Think about it, Rollo trading his longship for a ducal crown in Normandy. See, not the great balancing 3 thrones on his brow, or Olaf Trigvassen using baptismal fonts as tools of conquest. These were men who understood that real power wasn't just taken, it was built to last. The proof lies in the echoes still shaping our world today. Walk through York's winding streets, where Viking-era walls still stand, or trace the genetic legacy of Norse settlers in places like Iceland and the Scottish Isles. Even the days of our week Thor's Day, Freya's Day whisper their influence, but perhaps the most astonishing legacy is how these leaders defied expectations. Gorm the Old quietly unified Denmark, while Sigrid the haughty outmaneuvered kings twice her size. Lagertha shattered stereotypes, proving shieldmaidens weren't just sagas but reality. And Leif Erikson, he reached North America centuries before Columbus, then shrugged and sailed home because Vinland lacked good trade routes. That pragmatic audacity captures the Viking spirit perfectly. So what's the takeaway from these sagas of blood and crowns? That history's greatest leaders adapt. Whether through Ivar the Boneless's ruthless strategy or Magnus the Good's unexpected mercy, they grasped a truth we still wrestle with today. Power is fleeting, but legacy is eternal. Their dynasties crumbled, yes, but their ideas didn't. From parliaments to place names, their fingerprints linger everywhere. Hungry for more? Dive into our Viking history playlist where we unpack the sagas, ships, and secrets behind these legendary figures. Hit like if you enjoyed this journey, subscribe to join us on the next adventure, and raise a horn to the past scale.